German soldiers of the 258th Infantry Division stood at Khimki on December 2, 1941, close enough to see the smoke of Moscow's chimneys, and this time they did not stop. Operation Typhoon had opened 2 months earlier, on October 2, and in its first 3 weeks it had annihilated 2 Soviet fronts. The double encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk swallowed roughly 600,000 prisoners by mid-October and tore a hole in the Soviet line that no reserve existed to fill. The road to Moscow lay open, and the Germans could not walk down it because the autumn rains had turned every road into a river of mud. The Rasputitsa saved the capital in October. It mired both armies equally, but only one of them was trying to advance. Georgy Zhukov took command of the Western Front on October 10th, after Ivan Konev's front had been shattered. Konev was handed the newly formed Kalinin front on the 17th. The ministries, the diplomatic corps, and the industrial commissariats began evacuating to Kuibyshev on October 15th and 16th. The panic of October 16th emptied the shops and the rail stations, and a state of siege was declared on the 19th. Stalin stayed. On November 6th, he spoke at Mayakovskaya station, and on November 7th, he stood on the Lenin Mausoleum while units marched past him and directly out to the front. Then the ground froze hard in mid-November, and the Germans came on again from November 15. The 3rd Panzer Group took a bridgehead over the Moscow-Volga Canal at Yakroma on November 28th and lost it within 2 days. Reconnaissance reached the Khimki area at the end of the month. In the history we know, the cold went deeper, deep enough to seize engines, freeze gun oil, and burn out divisions already at 1/3 of their establishment strength, and the offensive died within sight of Moscow's tram lines. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened had the frost stopped short of that threshold, and why the real history unfolded differently. The difference was a matter of degrees. A moderate freeze, arriving late and holding steady, hardens the approaches without cracking the block of a truck engine or turning a machine gun into a club. Roads that had been impassable slurry in November carried wheeled transport again. Fuel and ammunition moved forward at something like the rate the operational plans had always assumed. That mattered most to Günther von Kluge. His Fourth Army held the center of the German line west of Moscow, and through late November his caution about committing it was the single largest break on Army Group Center's advance. Kluge was not being timid without reason. His infantry were exhausted, his flanks were unsupported, and Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group was strung out to the north. But with the roads carrying, the arithmetic changed. The probe toward Khimki was reinforced rather than recalled. On the Naro-Fominsk axis, the 258th Division pushed through Burtsevo and Yushkovo, and this time nothing threw it back. The seam between the Soviet 5th and 33rd Armies opened. Zhukov's line west of the capital was thin by design. He had stripped it to hold reserves he intended to spend on December 5 and 6, not before. The Siberian and Far Eastern divisions released from the Manchurian border on Richard Sorge's assessment, confirmed by signals intelligence that Japan would strike south, were arriving in echelon, and they were arriving into a crisis on the Kalinin sector. They were fed in as they detrained. They were spent as fire brigades rather than massed as a hammer. The first shock, the 10th, and the 20th Armies were consumed before they could be committed together. Guderian's failure at Tula still left the German southern shoulder unhinged, and that would matter later, but not in the first week of December. Moscow was not primarily a symbol. It was a switchboard. 11 main lines radiated outward from it, and nearly all north-south lateral traffic in European Russia was routed through its junctions. Whatever else the city was, it was the single point through which the Red Army moved armies from one front to another. German troops reached the rail belt in the second week of December, and the fighting through the outer districts was slow, street by street, house by house, and expensive in a way that nothing in the advance had been. Militia battalions, NKVD units, factory workers, and whatever regular formations could be scraped together fought in the northern and western terminals. The Germans took the terminals. What they did not take was a functioning railway. The junction was wrecked by demolition, by shelling, and by the simple fact that no yard can be worked under fire. That was the real loss. Not the buildings, not the flag. From the moment the junction stopped working, the Soviet High Command could no longer shift forces laterally across its own front at operational speed. Moving a division from Kalinin to Tula now meant a detour of hundreds of miles over lines never built to carry that load. The Red Army did not cease to exist. It ceased to be one army. Stalin left at the last hour. He had staked something specific on staying. His authority in the autumn of 1941 rested visibly on the fact that he had not gone when everyone else went, that he had spoken at Mayakovskaya and stood at the parade while the government sat 600 miles east on the Volga. Leaving cost him that. What arrived in Kuibyshev was a head of state joining a government that had already learned to function without him physically present. The State Defense Committee, formed on June 30th with Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and Voroshilov, remained the sole channel through which authority, production, and terror all passed, and now it had to project all three down telegraph wire to commanders who had just watched the capital fall. Distance is corrosive to that kind of power. Orders that had been unarguable in Moscow arrived in Kuibyshev's name and had to be enforced. So they were enforced, hard. The GKO became an instrument for demonstrating that the center still held, commanders removed, blame assigned, the machinery of the state turned inward to prove it was still working. The regime did not fall. Regimes of that construction rarely fall from losing a city. They fall when the apparatus of coercion stops obeying, and the apparatus of coercion had followed the government east. But something had changed that no order could repair. The Soviet state was now a thing that governed from where it had fled to. Army Group Center got Moscow, and Moscow was worth less than the map suggested. The factories had gone east in October, machine tools and all, on the very rail lines the Germans had just severed. The power plants were sabotaged or stripped, there was no food stock worth the name, and there were still civilians, hundreds of thousands of them, whom the Germans had neither the intention nor the capacity to feed. Holding the city cost more than taking it. Garrison duty absorbed formations that were already at a third of strength. Partisan activity in the rear areas, which had been a nuisance in the autumn, became a permanent drain once the front stopped moving. And the supply line still ended where it had always ended, at the Smolensk gauge break, where every ton of everything had to be transshipped from European standard gauge to Russian broad gauge or onto trucks. The Germans had captured the greatest rail junction in the Soviet Union and could not use it because they could not feed track into it. Von Bock's army wintered in a ruin. It was not a base for a spring offensive. It was a salient with a city in it, drawing men and fuel from everything else the Wehrmacht wanted to do in 1942. Pearl Harbor happened on schedule. The carriers had sailed from Hitokapu Bay on November 26, and by early December the decision was fixed and past recall. Nothing occurring outside Moscow could have reached those ships or changed that plan. Japan struck south as Sorge had reported it would. But the fall of Moscow reopened an argument in Tokyo that had been settled and shelved. The army's northern faction had planned Kantakuyan for a Soviet collapse in 1941 and had put it away when no collapse came. Now collapse looked arguable again, and the argument's force was not that Japan should attack the Soviet Union, it was that Japan should be ready to. So the Kwantung Army in Manchuria was reinforced instead of stripped. Divisions and air groups that in our history moved south to the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma stayed on the Amur, waiting for an opportunity that the Soviets, having pulled their far eastern divisions west, could no longer credibly deter. The effect was quiet and cumulative. Japan fought its Pacific offensive with less than it might have had, hedging against a northern war it never opened. And the Soviet Far East, denuded of its best formations, spent 1942 watching a border that stayed closed by inches. Lend-Lease survived the fall of Moscow. What it lost was its geometry. The first protocol had been signed in Moscow on October 1st, and the routes it established assumed a rail net with the capital at its heart. Arctic convoys landed at Arkhangelsk and Murmansk because from there the freight went south, and south meant through Moscow's junctions. With those junctions in German hands, the northern route became a supply line into a pocket. The tonnage still arrived, it simply could not get to where the fighting was. The weight of the whole program shifted to the two long ways around, the Persian Corridor, opened by the Anglo-Soviet occupation of Iran in August 1941, and the Pacific route to Vladivostok carried in Soviet-flagged ships that Japan, still formally neutral toward Moscow, did not interdict. Both were slow, both were enormously long, and both fed into the Volga and Ural industrial belt rather than into any army's rear. That last point shaped 1942 more than the tonnage figures did. Aid arrived where the factories were, not where the front was, and it was consumed as industrial input, trucks, aluminum, machine tools, rolling stock, rather than delivered as combat power. The Red Army of 1942 was rebuilt with American materials rather than reinforced by them. The Eastern Front reorganized around what was left. Without Moscow's junctions, the Soviet Union fought as a set of regional commands, a northern group around Leningrad and the Volkhov, a Volga-centered mass, a southern theater running down toward the Caucasus, each drawing on the evacuated industry behind it, each coordinated by radio and courier and by a state defense committee issuing orders from 600 miles east of where its armies stood. Offensives happened. They happened locally, and they did not combine. The Germans held a line they could not shorten. Moscow had to be garrisoned because abandoning it would have made the winter's cost visible. The flanks had to be held because Tula and the southern shoulder had never been resolved, and every mile of that front drew supply through a gauge break at Smolensk that no amount of engineering effort ever fully fixed. Army Group Center in 1942 was not poised to finish anything. It was pinned by its own trophy. The war did not end. That is the part worth sitting with, because the assumption underneath every version of this question, the assumption that a capital is a heart, and that taking it stops the body, is the assumption the whole record of 1941 argues against. The Soviet Union had already moved its industry, already moved its government, and already demonstrated that it would trade space for time on a scale no other combatant contemplated. What the loss of Moscow took from it was not survival but coherence, the ability to act as one thing in one direction at one time. That is a slower kind of injury and a longer war. The center of gravity moved 600 miles east, and the fighting went on around it for years.